Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story begins on one incredibly joyful day for all the inhabitants of the Empire, and all because the team to conquer the Light Dragon finally achieved their victory, and so all the people that day went to various pubs and bars to celebrate this event. Of course, many still could not believe that these warriors managed to do this. Some even heard that this monster almost killed them all. However, one of these warriors was not at all as happy as the rest. He was sitting in his estate and also drinking. Even though it was a truly joyful event that he had been waiting for many years, he had nothing to be so happy about. He was sitting all alone, but then suddenly one of his assistants came into his room and immediately asked why everything was so gloomy. When the guy walked inside and saw his boss, he immediately asked in surprise, was he really sitting alone in a dark room and drinking on such a happy day? The guy also added that it didn't matter how awful he felt. A hero shouldn't behave like that. That's why it was hard for him to watch all of this. The man smiled at that moment and said that he was really only doing it because he hoped that alcohol would help him forget how great their hatred was. In order to change the subject of conversation, which was unpleasant for him, the man asked, "How is the tracking of magic going there?" His assistant was a little surprised to hear this question, but replied that the Light Dragon's power had not yet been completely absorbed, and also asked that he just give them some time and then everything would be fine. The man, hearing this, immediately stood up from his seat and asked, "Do they really need more?" This amazed him, but he also said that many years have passed since they have been unsuccessfully searching for evidence of the person who killed this monster. Meanwhile, the man, without explaining anything, simply walked out the door and left his assistant alone, completely surprised by this whole situation. Then he looked down and suddenly saw an unpacked suitcase containing a small toy in the shape of a rabbit. He looked at all this, and after that, sighing heavily, he whispered to himself that he would definitely avenge him, and then everything would be fine. The guy who was sitting alone that night drinking his alcohol was named Alex, and he went outside to unwind a little. Walking along the deserted streets, he decided to put a blindfold on himself so that everything would be normal. One of his acquaintances, who also usually drove the carriage, came up to him and said that if anything happened, although, even if nothing happened, he definitely wanted Alex to contact him. He explained that he could help with absolutely anything that was needed. The guy thanked Sir Superior and went on without even stopping. The guy, watching Alex, thought that he really was a hero who saved this world, and for him personally, it was an incredibly great honor to fight alongside him on the conquest team. Then he followed Alex and said that if he did not have a bride, he would like to introduce him to his niece, because she was a wonderful lady who could be suitable for this role. As soon as Alex heard this, he immediately became furious, but holding back his emotions, he thanked the man and said that everything was fine and there was no need for this. The boy, heading to his cart to go home, said that in any case he could contact him and wished him luck in everything. Alex just stood there at that moment, watching the cart go by and thought, what was the point of saving this world anyway? They couldn't even save the most important person to him, so he was completely desperate. At that moment, his assistant was in a special place, where they honored the memory of one deceased but incredibly important person for them. He took this rabbit, which he had just recently seen in the suitcase, and having seated it on the chair, turned to Rio, saying that he was incredibly bored. Then he picked up the toy again and said that very soon he would definitely find the man who killed him. And he didn't care at all what he had to go through, and because of this, he was ready to kill this terrible bastard with his own hands. In fact, this story was not so dark from the very beginning. Some time ago, people lived completely differently. And so, one fine sunny day, the man who ran the small shop finally got copies of the books, and a crowd of different men and women crowded around him, wanting to buy one copy from him. Of course, the seller was incredibly happy, and he said that The Light Dragon Conquest Team was a book that contained a saga about heroes. It was an exclusive report from a journalist, even with portraits in the book. One girl, who hid her face, approached the man and asked for one copy for herself, and also paid for it with a coin. When the man gave her the book, she walked away a little and immediately opened it. And then she stopped because she was very surprised. But as soon as she opened it on the character she needed, she was very surprised, because it didn't look like the person she was thinking about. And the description, of course, didn't match her knowledge. However, in any case, absolutely all of these people had gone through many trials, so she was incredibly happy that she could have this copy of the book, which at least a little bit described their traits. In fact, this story became quite dark for the girl after she began to fight death. and also her childhood friends who hated her but still for some reason communicated with her. And then one day, Alex's assistant, who was really serious about finding the killer, came to the girl and asked, "Is it really her?" He asked in a firm voice if she was the person who killed his friend after he killed the crown prince. He also asked her, with a surprised expression on his face, if she really wanted to live a luxurious life like the last princess after committing all these atrocities. He took out his weapon, as did Alex, and some other people who came with him to do these terrible things. They all said that they would never forgive this girl, whose name was Lilia Oria. As soon as the girl heard all this, she immediately realized that this was all wrong, because she was not the person they came for. In fact, she knew very well that the truth could not be revealed. The Leo they knew was also the person with whom they shared precious memories and experiences. And the truth was that this man was no longer alive. In the afterlife, as soon as the girl heard this, she immediately began to choke from the horror she experienced. She stood in front of them and couldn't believe that she was now going to die at the hands of her best childhood friend just because there was a misunderstanding. In fact, a few years ago, when they were all still very young, an incident occurred in the sacred neutral zone of the Kreutz Sanctuary. The boys who studied at that institution were walking near the lake with their teacher when they suddenly heard some strange sounds nearby. It was the cry of one of the little children who saw someone fall into the pond. But when they looked more closely, they immediately saw that it was the Crown Prince of Rio. Then the boy with blonde hair took off his hat and immediately running to the lake, said that he would save his life. Of course, everyone around him was very surprised by his actions because they were so scared that they couldn't even move. However, the guy, having dived into the water, was finally able to get His Highness out of the water and pulled him to the shore in order to provide first aid if necessary. He suddenly screamed at the teacher who was standing next to him and said that there was too much water in his lungs, so he had to act incredibly quickly so that he wouldn't suffocate. Of course, no one argued with him. Then the guy, activating his magical abilities, made one hieroglyphic circle and thus began to use a special technique so that Rio could cough up all the water he swallowed. One of the teachers turned to her friend and said that even though she was trying to treat him, his body temperature was still not rising. Almost all the water was gone, but it was not working. She asked that he be taken to a warm place as soon as possible and that warm water be brought to warm him up. But the moment he made his final cough of water, Rio immediately screamed, saying that he was okay. Then the girls looked at him in surprise, and he, just hugging his knees to himself, said that he was completely fine. So he asked them to just leave him alone, and also thanked them for their help. After he returned back to the room, they gave him a hot bath, and he sat there and began to warm up, and also reassured himself with words that everything was fine and nothing else would happen. After that, he went to his luxurious bed, and these terrible thoughts did not leave him. He thought that, of course, he would not die, but the fear was still present. He was incredibly cold, and the guy was also so tired that he could barely stay conscious at all. However, when he closed his eyes, he realized that he had a feeling as if he had already endured such terrible pain alone before. And then he suddenly remembered that when he was in the hospital, he could do very little because he had no strength due to a serious illness. In fact, she was incredibly tired of reading all those romance novels at the time, so she decided to focus only on the games on her phone, which brought her great pleasure. The girl, lying on her hospital bed, finally reached the final part of her game and was very happy because she thought that if she concentrated, she would be able to finish it that very day. She started playing and thought that now that she'd managed to collect a lot of resources, she would be able to cure the illness of the village girl she was playing as. In fact, in these games it was possible to do absolutely everything. If the girl continued to collect materials, then whether it was money or life, everything would be exactly as she wanted. Lying in bed and suffering from a serious illness, she could thus live the life she never had and never would have. That's why games saved her madly. Of course, all this fiction was much better than her harsh reality, in which she had to wake up and go to sleep every day. It was an incredibly horrible and painful life of an incurable man who simply wakes up every day with the hope that this will be his last day of suffering. One day, lying on her bed, she thought that if she could be reborn, she would really like to live her life in the game she always played. Of course, the girl wished for this, but she could not even imagine that such a thing could ever happen. She also thought that since someone had granted her wish, it had to be done right. Of course, she was very happy that she had been reborn, but she had not been included in the game she had been playing. In fact, it was the plot of a novel she had read in a past life, and of course it had a love theme, since most of what she read had exactly that kind of theme. And now the girl had to live in the role of one character, whose name was Lilia Aria. As soon as she woke up in her new image and looked in the mirror, she could not believe that she had actually moved into the role of this particular character. After some time, the maids who always served her suddenly knocked on her room door. They turned to Her Highness and immediately asked if she was feeling better, because they were really incredibly worried after what had happened a few hours ago. Lily, smiling a little, immediately said that she was fine and asked if they could leave her alone, since she wanted to rest. One of the maids immediately said in a trembling voice that she understood everything, and also added that if she suddenly needed anything, then of course, she could immediately call them to her. Lily thanked them, and then lay down on the bed again with a very strong heat in her body. In fact, she knew very well that the crown prince of the Oria Empire had almost died, and if the higher-ups found out about it, it would be a real disaster. It is quite natural that she was incredibly worried about this, because she had moved into this very character. Rio was only able to survive thanks to the priests who healed her with their holy power. Then she looked at the hand that bore one of their marks, and thought that, as a minor character, almost nothing had been written about this man anywhere in history. Therefore, no matter how carefully the girl read this novel, she could not clearly know what was happening to this man all the time. So now, all she could think about was that because of all this, her life would be completely meaningless. In fact, the current emperor of this story was Redius Aurea. His younger sister, Princess Iris, died tragically. However, when she was alive, she fell in love with a commoner knight and bore him a daughter. This daughter was, in fact, Lilia Aurea, in whose body the girl now lived. Her father was a commoner, and her mother died shortly after giving birth. And at that time, there was an incredibly large chaos within the empire due to the struggle for a place on the throne. So due to all these numerous factors, poor Lily was completely forgotten by everyone and sent to live in a small tower on the edge of the castle all alone. She had incredibly torn and dirty clothes and a very fragile body that always got damaged at the slightest touch. And there were only a few people who came to her and left quite quickly because they simply brought her a small portion of food so that she at least did not die of hunger. Despite the fact that it was a rather difficult and lonely life, it was peaceful, because no one beat the girl, no one mocked her. Redius appeared. From then on, everything went wrong. One day he called her to him and began to scold his dead sister, calling her an idiot, because it was very stupid of her to give birth to a daughter. He believed that she should have just gotten rid of the girl, and that's all. Redius eventually chose to fight for the throne and became emperor. However, he treated poor Lilia completely differently than she expected. He turned to the maids who were standing around and asked who else knew about this child. One of the maids replied that no one but them knew about all this. Then the man remained in his place and began to approach the girl. He grabbed her hand very roughly and with a strong grip and said that there was a blood oath sign printed on her hand. Of course, it was clear that she was part of the royal family, and she just so happened to be the same age as their crown prince, Rio. So, smiling, he said that this was all very well. Then looking at the guard, he told him to kill all the servants. Of course, without thinking twice, everyone did just that. Lily was simply horrified. She did not understand what was happening at all. After all, before this, her life was peaceful and calm, but now everything went wrong. In the distant past, on the continent of Draconea, a very bloodthirsty and ill-fated dragon woke up. At that time, 5 knights and the leader of the Kratia Church defeated the dragon and were able to save this world. And these 5 knights became heroes who founded their own empires, and the head of the church shared the dragon magic and also recognized the power of each royal family. And one day this dragon had to awaken again, so the knights made a sacrifice, a bloody sacrifice, answering the call of the Church of Krecht. Many years have passed since then, and yet, as predicted, a new dragon egg has appeared. This egg was indestructible, and around it swarmed dark magic that killed absolutely all people who only approached it. And those lucky ones who could get close and tried to destroy it had an even more unfortunate fate. And eventually, the ferocious monsters woke up again and attacked this beautiful and peaceful world. All the inhabitants who lived in the empire were overcome with all kinds of anxiety because they understood perfectly well that this would definitely not end well. And the Church of Kratia gathered the 5 emperors again. And in preparation for the day when the egg would hatch, they decided that the descendants of the empires should be trained in the temple. So now there were 5 children, descendants of the heroes who bore the mark, and all of them were admitted to the temple in order to, like their parents, protect this world from the greatest danger. So without thinking twice, Lily's uncle cut her hair so short that she now looked like a boy. He started screaming and said that he was really tired of these royal idiots who think that they are the only ones right in this world. Only now that he had finally managed to get rid of the thorn in his side was he able to ascend to the throne. Although the temple was a neutral zone, the possibility of assassination could not be ignored, of course. Therefore, he could not unconditionally send his only son, whom he loved and cherished incredibly, to this place. Of course, he didn't want to send him to his death straight into the dragon's lair, so he made poor Lily into a semblance of his son to take that place. He looked the girl straight in the eyes and asked if she understood that she was now the crown prince of their empire, and not who she had been before. From that moment on, Lily turned into Rio Or and was in his place. Of course, the girl understood perfectly well that this was simply a terrible decision, and she was also very irritated by the emperor who made it. She didn't understand how he could do that to the poor girl who had been all alone all this time. He had sent her to the temple instead of the crown prince without paying attention. She considered this decision too much and didn't know what would happen next. However, this of course had its privileges, because Lily could now finally eat simply delicious food, so of course she did not object or protest in any way. Now that she was in this place, she realized that she probably didn't even have a choice. If she had started to somehow resist all this, then nothing would have come of it anyway. When she was alone in her castle locked in, she couldn't eat normally. So now, looking at this whole situation, she decided to think positively, because that was the only way to cope with all her grief normally. If the story had developed as originally planned, then after a lifetime of pain, the girl would have finally been able to slip into the royal palace pond and simply die. So as long as she was in this temple, she was safe. Besides, even if she asked someone for help, she couldn't just reveal her identity as Lily. At that moment, the girl was overcome with horror, because if she did something wrong, the magic of the Emperor's golden word would be activated, and then she would definitely be in trouble. She will simply be covered in blood and die right before his eyes, and he will not even blink an eye. Now that the girl was in this place, she realized that absolutely nothing had changed. From her past life, she was haunted by the fate of death, which did not leave her for a step. The girl now did not know whether she should simply shake with fear and wait for the day of her death for the second time. However, it was also quite strange for her to perceive the fact that she had to live in a story that someone else had already decided for her in advance. Lily thought that perhaps she would be able to die again quite quietly, without the pain and intense suffering that usually happened to everyone. But even this thought scared her, so she really hoped that it would not happen. The girl moved to a new body at the age of, so she still had some time before the worst happened. She was also very pleased with the fact that she already knew all the events that were supposed to happen in advance, so she had her own privileges. She figured it couldn't be that hard to just not let herself die in a pond, so she was very serious about not letting that happen. She decided to just avoid any body of water, and then everything would be different. First of all, Lily understood that she would have to hold out in this temple for another 3 whole years before she could finally go beyond its borders. And she also understood that she had to play the role of the crown prince perfectly, because no one should find out that she was a fake, because then her life would definitely be cut short. When the next day came, the girl changed into her uniform and went outside to go to class. There wasn't much left for her to do, so Lily thought it shouldn't be a problem. Then the girl went towards the place where she was supposed to have a lesson, but she did not notice how there was some guy nearby who was following her. In fact, in the temple, in addition to the children from the other 4 families who bear the sign of the covenant, there were also children who were gathered from different countries from noble families so that they could all live together. When Lily came to them, she always stood aside and observed their behavior. She understood that they probably all wanted to strengthen their bonds as soon as possible, because one day they would all have to unite and kill one dragon. In fact, in their empire, acts of status distinction among children were forbidden. Sometimes they even had to participate in events that resembled sports festivals. However, outside of daily prayers, they spent their free time as they wished. Compared to the environment in which the girl had lived until that day, this place was a real paradise for her. After all, there was nothing like her previous life in this place, so she was happy. And besides, when they go to the cafeteria, she can always eat incredibly delicious and expensive food that she has never tried before. Suddenly, 2 girls walked past Lily, talking about something. One of them looked very worried and said that she just couldn't get used to the food that was served in this establishment. Her friend agreed with her and said that even just getting dressed in the morning took too much energy from her, and the food they served couldn't replenish it as much as it needed. The dark-haired girl sighed heavily and said that she even had to wash her hair herself for the first time since she arrived in this place. And her friend, smiling happily, asked why they couldn't take servants with them to this place, since they were already used to doing everything with them, and now they were completely uncomfortable. They began to drift further and further apart, but still continued to discuss the situation they were now forced to survive in. They were fed up with the lack of variety in clothing and the fact that they had to wear the same uniform every day. They all missed the beautiful and luxurious dresses that they could change every week, and the events that their parents organized. In general, they certainly did not like this place. When Lily heard all this, she was very surprised, because in fact she really liked this place. And besides, this form was very comfortable. Of course, she knew that this was all because the previous clothes she wore in the tower were just a doormat after being used many times. In reality, the children of the royal and noble families were in the temple preparing for the great dragon hunt. The original story did not tell how they lived and what hardships they had to endure. And the reason for all this is that this place is not the main setting for the entire story of the novel. It was only mentioned later in the form of rumors, when the children had already grown up and discussed their childhood, which they spent there. And Lily, who came to this place instead of Prince Leo, was not mentioned at all in any rumors among the aristocrats and not only in history. The place where I was supposed to die, Lily? It was a pond in the imperial palace of the Awaria Empire, which means that the 3 years she spent in that place were pretty good. At least she didn't have the chance to die. So, knowing that the girl was not in danger, she decided to focus her attention on achieving the same result. However, no matter how she looked at it, stumbling and falling into the pond and then dying was quite strange for her, because she did not understand how one could not notice all this and die so stupidly. Lily even wondered where her character's mind was at that moment, since she allowed such a stupid and absurd death. When the girl came to dinner, she kept thinking that she was even glad that no one killed her, because then she would have had a much harder time coping with her death. Because Lily was too focused on her thoughts, she didn't even notice how a blonde guy approached her and, after greeting her, asked if everything was okay with her. Lily, as soon as she heard someone's voice, immediately turned to the side because she did not expect that someone would talk to her. But when she saw in front of her the guy who had pulled her out of the pond, she became completely embarrassed because he was looking at her with his sky-blue eyes and smiling. Lily remained silent, and the boy, to fill the awkward silence, said that she looked like she was fine, so he decided not to worry too much. To remind Lily of his exploits, he smiled joyfully and said that yesterday it was he, the only person, who jumped into the water to save her life. And he asked her if she knew about it. The girl was a little embarrassed and thanked him in a trembling voice for saving her, but she said nothing more. Then she began to examine his appearance carefully, and immediately realized that this beautiful boy with blonde hair was Romeo Roseberry. In fact, this guy was the prince of the Roseberry Empire, and one of the main heroes of the Great Dragon Hunting Party. This man was also one of those typical fish-in-a-barrel types who fall in love with the heroine at first sight. Therefore, she understood perfectly well that this man was the main character of the original story. Lily stared at him and immediately thought that he had a pretty kind and decent personality, so she didn't think she should worry about it. Romeo remained silent for a while, and then asked her to stop staring at him like that and just say something, and also asked if her mouth was sewn up or something like that. Lily immediately realized that she was being rude, so making her voice rougher to sound like a man's, she said that she was really grateful to him for saving her. He then moved closer to her and asked if the boy was not the crown prince. He was surprised that with such a high status, all he could say was a simple thank you. Romeo looked completely unfriendly and asked if that was the only thing the guy knew, so he couldn't answer anything else. Lily was very surprised. She could not believe that in this Romeo, his kindness and mercy that she saw in the story when she read the book disappeared. Turning away from the boy, she said in a trembling voice that she did not understand at all why he was pestering her like that, and also asked if he really wanted something from her. Smiling happily, Romeo said that of course he was not just sitting next to her for no reason. The priest would come looking for him during prayer a little later, and he came to ask Rio to tell them that Romeo went to his room and just fell asleep there. And the guy also clarified that the most important thing was to say that they should under no circumstances wake him up. When Lily heard this, she immediately became wary. In fact, she understood perfectly well that he was asking her to lie right in front of the saints for his own benefit. The guy also said that he usually pretends to be a very quiet and considerate person, and also that he is way above all this. He is certainly a prince, so he has the right to maintain such a reputation. However, Romeo also added that since he had such a high status, if he said all this, of course, he would be believed. So he asked the guy what he thought about it. With a heavy sigh, Lily nevertheless agreed to do it, because she understood perfectly well that she was in his debt, and that this guy would not leave her alone if she did not help. As soon as the guy got his, he immediately smiled smugly and said that he was very glad that they came to a common opinion. When Lily looked at him, she realized that he looked incredibly dignified and very neat while eating, but his personality did not at all match this picture that he deliberately paints for others. Then she looked at her bowl of soup and realized that while she could stay in the dining room, she needed to eat well, because the time she would spend in the temple was only 3 years. One day she knew very well that she would return to her homeland, and therefore she would have very big problems with proper nutrition. Perhaps she would be locked in the tower again, and she would not be able to eat normally anymore. But Romeo was still sitting next to her and said that she needed to think about something, namely whether she even had a symbol on her palm. Lily was a little surprised by such a sudden question, but immediately said that, of course, she had this symbol because she was the crown prince. And the guy, hearing this, immediately beamed with joy and said that he was really interested in what it looked like and whether it existed at all. Therefore, he really wanted her to show it to him. Lily, of course, found this easy, so she held out her hand, which had the symbol on it. Then Romeo looked at his hand, on which this symbol was also depicted, and sighing heavily, said that apparently everyone really has the same sign. For some time there was complete silence between them, because he sat, and looking at his symbol, thought about something. But Lily, meanwhile, looked around and noticed that many girls were looking in their direction. They were all very embarrassed, and their skin was red from excitement. She couldn't understand what was going on at all or why they were reacting like that. But then she looked in the direction everyone was turning and immediately understood. In fact, another kid with dark hair came into the dining room, and it was Griffith, Micaiah. And as soon as Romeo saw him, he immediately frowned, and he looked really very angry. The guy told the girl that he really hated this boy with all his heart, but he didn't even explain the reasons. And Lilia was really surprised because she didn't even suspect that Romeo, this guy, might not like her, and she also became interested in the reason for such a sharp reaction. In fact, Griffith was a rather important person who fought alongside them against the Great Dragon, and he was also a loyal subject of the Nike Empire, so she didn't understand at all why he hated him. Griffith was the man who would later become the Fire Sage of the Nicean Empire, so he played an important role in this story. He was also destined to become the strongest paladin in all of history. They were so sharp-tongued and also cold-blooded. But despite all these qualities, he is even incredibly handsome. So many girls are crazy about him. However, be that as it may, Lily did not know whether Romeo had been on rather bad terms with this man all this time, because she believed that they had always been friends. The guy sighed heavily and said that he really hated this man incredibly much, because he was pathetic and very stupid. When Lily looked to the side, she saw a fair-haired guy who was sitting right in front of them, and he had ruby-colored eyes, and there was no one next to him. He was completely alone. After thinking for a moment, the girl immediately recognized who it was. This man was Oscar Herselwerk. She understood perfectly well that he was a little older than the girl, but still, judging by his appearance, it seemed to her that he was younger than her. In fact, she also knew very well how difficult his childhood had been, so she could understand why he was so withdrawn while at the academy. As she looked at this guy who was sitting all alone, she noticed that now he looked quite fragile, but in the future he would be a completely different person. In fact, readers later even called him a psycho-patriotic emperor, and some were even afraid of him. Oscar, who continued to sit next to the girl, said that he hated him, and also pointed towards another boy, who was also alone, and said that he didn't like him either. This is what Lily definitely didn't expect to hear because the guy pointed to Alex Asgard, the person who was closest to Romeo. Oscar's childhood was truly just awful, and at the academy everyone also made fun of him, not understanding why he was behaving so strangely. When the children cornered the poor boy, he just sat there shaking with fear and crying loudly because it reminded him of his past. And he remembered that moment when he was still little, and being next to his family and friends, he held his dying mother in his arms. The man who did this to her screamed at the boy, asking what he was doing, and also wondering how he dared to turn his eyes away from his mother's death. This villain asked the boy to look closely at his dying mother with his eyes, and not to dare to turn away under any circumstances. He asked Oscar if the boy knew why his eyes were red, and then explained that it was all because it was the blood of those who died before his eyes. This villain also said that the splashes got into his eyes, and in his case, there is no way for them to become normal again. This man said that they will now remain bloodshot forever, and he will look worthless. This man also called the poor boy, who had already suffered a lot, a monster. He continued to call him a monster, and Oscar tried to close his ears so as not to hear all this, because he had already suffered a lot. At that moment, when everything was finally over, he heard the quiet voice of his mother speaking to him. The boy immediately looked at her, and she said that all these wounds were incredibly painful and asked him to save her. But of course, Oscar could not do anything because he was just a little boy who was incredibly scared. His mother's reached for his eyes, and she continued to beg for salvation. After this, the boy began to see various people. These were the maids, who were also lying dead, but for some reason stood up and began to approach him. That often, when he was offended, he closed himself off, and all these memories just covered him with their heads, and he could not do anything with them. And so, when one day the children started making fun of him again, Lilia ran up to him and told him that he needed to get out of his thoughts. The boy immediately opened his eyes and looked in surprise at the child standing next to him. The girl, meanwhile, grabbed him by the shoulders and tried to convey to Oscar that everything he saw was a lie and not real. She tried to calm him down, telling him that he shouldn't listen to everything that the person in his head said. Oscar was incredibly surprised and didn't understand what was happening. In fact, those memories turned out to be incredibly realistic, and therefore it was very difficult for him to get out of this state. However, Lilia looked at him with her azure eyes and asked him to look at her and calm down little by little. He sat and looked at her with tears in his eyes. The girl, meanwhile, said in a stern but confident voice that the place he was in was absolutely safe. He should not worry. She also said that he was not harmed. No one was harmed. It was all just in his head, an unreal event, just a fiction. He immediately calmed down. He was incredibly pleased that she had come and supported him. Meanwhile, the saints had already run out of the temple and were anxiously asking what was going on. They quickly approached Oscar and tried to calm him down, and also looked him over from head to toe to see if everything was okay with him. Lilia, meanwhile, moved to the side, and watching all this, she calmed down a little, because she saw that everything was okay with him now. And besides, he was in the hands of the educators, so there shouldn't have been any problems. In fact, the girl now understood perfectly well that she might be in big trouble, but she still did not regret doing it because it was unbearable for her to watch Oscar suffer. They took the boy in their arms and began to lead him back to the temple, and Lily only watched him go, remaining in place. This boy's biological father was an emperor, and he killed dozens of people as well as his wife right before his eyes. The cameraman called Oscar a monster with eyes filled with the blood of all those who were killed before his eyes. The emperor's voice has haunted Oscar throughout his life. However, there was one line from the original leading lady that he remembered forever, and only this girl was able to change his mind. She said that his eyes were really just incredibly beautiful, and then he realized that it was so. This little line allowed Oscar to forget his unhappy childhood and finally find salvation in this world. And the girl, when she read it in the novel, was incredibly happy. She thought that his eyes were really just beautiful, and she was happy that at least someone helped Oscar. However, seeing him right before her eyes in the reality she now lived in, she noticed that he was too small, thin, and helpless. Lilia, of course, could not even imagine that he would have such a cruel childhood in which he would be humiliated all the time, even in the place where, on the contrary, they should have united and been one team. So Lilia couldn't just stay in one place. She ran to those guys who were insulting him and told them to leave immediately. She ordered everyone else not to just stand there, but to call the teacher, because this was a serious situation that they would not be able to sort out on their own. Even though Lilia wasn't that attached to this character, she simply couldn't stand aside and turn a blind eye to all this. So now she was incredibly happy that she had made such a choice, and helped poor Oscar survive this whole nightmare at least for a while. She didn't want to get involved in all this at all, because that would only cause her even more problems. But it was tearing her soul apart from the inside, and that's why she did it. However, at that moment, Romeo suddenly approached her from behind and asked, "Is she really a heretic?" Lily heard this, was very surprised. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. Did he really see all this, but didn't even intend to help Oscar? The guy looked at her in surprise and asked, why should he help them at all? But without waiting for an answer from the girl, he said that her fall into the pond and these insults were completely different things, so he was not going to do anything about it. Lilia wasn't going to stay with him any longer. She just sighed heavily and started to walk away from him without saying a single word. When the girl heard that he was following her, she immediately became angry and asked why he started following her. Romeo, pretending that he had nothing to do with it, immediately asked what happened in the first place when she was near Oscar, and he asked what spell she used to do it. Lilia, sighing heavily, said that she had only tried to calm him down. It had been a normal panic attack, so she hadn't used any magic, of course. Normal support had helped him. But Romeo was not going to leave her alone and asked, wasn't he possessed by a demon at that moment? After all, that's exactly what it seemed to him. In fact, in the world she found herself in, ordinary people were incredibly limited, and they simply could not get support from anyone. Any person who suffered from the invisible was considered to be possessed by a demon. No one was going to delve into the whole situation and figure out the problem. It was easier for them to blame it on the demon and be done with it. Now Lila understood why absolutely no one was going to help Oscar, who was simply in a panic. They all thought that he was possessed by a demon and were not going to do anything. Even if this happens once or twice, no one pays attention to it. However, if the attacks happen repeatedly during his 3 years in this place, even the temples will begin to suspect that Oscar is possessed by a demon. Now it became perfectly clear to Lila that these were certainly the Emperor's true intentions when he sent him to this place. He was going to ruin Oscar's reputation and make another prince his heir, and also make everyone think very badly of the boy, and no one would communicate with him in the future. Thinking about all this, Lilia waved her hand and said that demons, of course, do not exist, and the guy simply saw illusions due to a traumatic event that happened to him in the past. The girl also said that absolutely every person has nightmares, so it was the same thing, only he was not sleeping at that moment. In very stressful situations, his brain played a cruel joke on him. However, Romeo still did not understand how one could have a nightmare if one was not sleeping. Lily, then turning to him, said that there are some people who experience and live through this. She stepped forward a little. Then the guy, catching up with her, asked if this wasn't stupid, since her argument had no basis or evidence. When Romeo finally caught up with her, he said that the crown prince of the accident did not quite understand how this world worked, and apparently had not studied the issue more thoroughly. Of course, Lilia got very angry when she heard all this. She thought that this man was a real nasty idiot, and she did not want to communicate with him so closely anymore. In fact, Lily was very disappointed when she met Romeo in person, because he turned out to be a completely different person. The guy treated the main character incredibly politely and even affectionately, and Lilia could not believe that he did not even understand the feelings of someone who was accused of being possessed by demons. Of course, it's all just awful when absolutely everyone turns away from you. But what irritated Lily most was that Romeo allowed himself to behave like this, although he himself had quite a few scars on his heart. But then suddenly, she was interrupted from her thoughts by the voice of a boy who said that she could continue and say more. At that moment, Lily looked at him in surprise, completely not understanding what he was talking about, so she asked what he meant. And the guy replied that she could tell about people who see nightmares in reality. He would like to know a little more about it. Suddenly he became very serious and said that he really wanted her to talk about it, and then he would be able to understand everything and change his mind, perhaps about Oscar. Of course, Romeo really looked very serious, and he really wanted to know about all this. You could see it in his eyes. When Lily looked at him, she immediately noticed that, of course, he was speaking absolutely seriously, so she decided to give in after all. The girl understood perfectly well that after all, he was just a child, so she could not blame him. She began her story. Lily replied that the human mind is actually quite fragile, and that is why their head is incredibly delicate and sensitive. Then she touched her head with her hand and said that inside the skull there was a fragile, stubborn, and perverted creature that absolutely controlled their entire organism. Romeo stood behind her at this point and listened carefully to all this, trying to understand what she was talking about. Lily continued her story, answering that if he witnessed a slightly shocking scene, then he would probably continue to remember it for some time, especially if it was a traumatic event. She also said that when his body weakens or gets tired, she makes him remember all these events over and over again. But the guy still didn't understand where she was leading with this, so he asked about it. Lilia sat down on a bench nearby and said that if all this were to happen again and again, it could be very painful for you. She explained that this shocking scene continues to replay in his mind for the rest of his life, to the point that he even forgets what is reality and what is not. Lilia also explained that some people suffer for the rest of their lives and eventually end their lives because they cannot stand it. Romeo, upon hearing this, immediately became indignant and said that suicide is a great sin that is not forgiven anywhere. He started screaming, saying that giving his soul to the devil was an act of betrayal of religion, of their faith, so it was completely unacceptable to him. Lilia, of course, did not object and said that, of course, all this is a sin. However, there are people who can do nothing about it, and they absolutely do not care whether they have sinned or not. The guy stood next to her the whole time, completely surprised. He decided to insist on his own anyway, and said that they didn't care because they were possessed by a demon. It was he who controlled their minds and actions. However, Lilia began to protest and said that it was not a demon at all. They were just suffering, that's all. Some people are much weaker than everyone else and cannot live with this for the rest of their lives, because for them, it is real torture. She explained that if people continue to endure all this, they will not be able to think accurately, and they come to the idea that only death can end all this, and that is why they commit such great sins. In fact, Lily wasn't at all surprised by the fact that Romeo was so interested in demons. This is all because his mother committed suicide, and witnessing this whole scene as a child had an incredible impact on the poor boy. Therefore, according to Lily, Romeo, like no one else, understood perfectly well what Oscar was feeling, but did not want to admit it to himself or somehow communicate with him. In fact, Romeo's mother had someone else whom she loved incredibly much. Her parents did not approve of their relationship, of course. Because of this, there were always disagreements and arguments. They ended up marrying the poor girl off to the emperor of the Roseberry Empire in order to gain power, money, and success for themselves. Her parents were not at all concerned about the well-being and true love of the girl, and the only happiness for her was that the emperor at least somehow tried to love her. He paid attention to her and never fussed badly, and her husband never reproached her and always patiently waited until she finally opened her heart to him, despite the fact that the girl was very stubborn and almost never made contact. Of course, this woman could not simply forget her beloved man, and the relationship between the emperor and empress became completely separate. So her worried parents came to threaten their daughter that they would just go and kill her lover. They began to blackmail their own daughter, saying that if she did not give birth to the crown prince, she would certainly never see her beloved man. This is how Romeo was born. Despite the fact that the empress's position was secured, her parents continued to exploit her weaknesses and always pressed on the girl's sore spots. Every time they wanted something, they always threatened the poor woman, holding her life in their own hands. She was just a puppet for them, with the help of which they could achieve everything they wanted. However, one day, the man she loved all her life, even in spite of all these obstacles, simply committed suicide because he could no longer endure all the humiliation and torture that was carried out on him. He knew very well that the empress would continue to suffer as long as he lived, and so he could not allow this to happen any longer. For her sake, he ended his life. Of course, Romeo's mother could not understand why he did this, and therefore even began to blame herself. And after that, she became seriously ill, and her condition only worsened with each passing day. Various hallucinations, poor sleep, constant stress, and depression appeared. Rumors that the empress was possessed by a demon spread in an instant, as people could not explain her strange behavior in any other way. And in the end, she simply chose the same end as the man she loved, without even thinking about her son and his future. She couldn't even imagine what little Romeo would see before his eyes. He saw her death, and it affected him so much that the boy's life was never the same again. Rumors began to spread incredibly quickly. The men who worked in the estate discussed the news because they heard that Her Majesty, the former empress, was possessed by a demon, and that was the reason she died. The boy, who heard everything perfectly, was very shocked, and people also began to say that even her son could suffer the same fate because he had her blood in him. So poor Romeo, who grew up receiving the love of his kind stepmother and father, did not suffer from hallucinations and delusions, of course, like Oscar. However, his wound still did not heal, and the fear of demons remained with him for quite a long time, because it caused him irreparable trauma. In the original work, Romeo confesses his feelings only to the main character. He did not even reveal his true identity and feelings to everyone else. He always wore a mask in public. So Lilia understood perfectly well that she could not pretend that she did not know about all this, because the day would definitely come when this wound would heal, and she would very much like to speed up this process. So, after a short silence to calm him down, she said that in any case, demons do not exist, and no matter how much it seemed to him, there will be a reason for every irrational decision. In order not to hurt the boy's tender feelings too much, she said that at least this was only her opinion. Lily also replied that there are only people who will hurt others until they themselves become the same, so there is no need to worry about demons that do not even exist. People are sometimes much worse. Romeo, when he heard all this, was silent for a while. His face suddenly turned red because of the feelings that overwhelmed his soul and body at that moment. In order not to appear weak, he said that in the end his thought was confirmed. He knew perfectly well that she was a heretic, and she had just proven it all with her words. Lilia heard this and was very surprised, but the guy explained that absolutely no one would say such things. And if she had told all this to the priests or the elders, then, of course, they would have called her a heretic, so he is of the same opinion. Lilia was genuinely surprised. She couldn't understand that he was saying all this seriously, and that the whole speech she had given had been completely useless. Suddenly she realized that the situation could get even worse. After all, if word spread that the crown prince of Avraria was a heretic, the emperor might even personally break her neck for it. So she quickly turned to Romeo and asked him if he even knew what would happen if he said something like that to anyone else. The guy was really very surprised and didn't understand what she was getting at, and so he asked if she was really trying to threaten him now, and telling him not to tell anyone about this. Lily immediately stood up from her seat. She grabbed him by the tie and said that everything was absolutely right. If he said even a word about it, then she would really just kill him. For a while, she continued to hold him by the collar, looking straight into his eyes, and asked if he understood everything she had told him. Of course, Romeo was incredibly scared at the time and didn't understand why she was acting like that, so he didn't answer her question right away. And when Lily saw his frightened expression, she was very happy, because he was just a 10-year-old child who was incredibly easy to scare, so she could be calm. However, the girl believed that it was too early for her to just relax like that. It was time to clarify the entire hierarchy of their relationship. She continued to hold him by the collar for a while longer, and didn't know whether she should tell him to call her by that name, because it would be much more respectful. At that moment, she suddenly remembered the organization that fought against the dragon, and immediately let the guy go. So smiling happily, she asked him to just call her captain. She thought it would be much better that way. Romeo was very surprised to hear this. He did not understand why she had suddenly changed so drastically. He immediately began to protest, and said that he absolutely did not want to do this, and also asked why she thought he should do this. He said that he was the one who exploited her weakness, so he doesn't understand at all why she suddenly decided to tell him what to do. But Lilia at that moment became incredibly serious and said that in that case, he was trying to tell her that he would become her enemy. As soon as Romeo heard this, he got angry, because he didn't want to be anyone's enemy, and he didn't want to be anyone's friend. However, she simply didn't leave him a choice. He sighed heavily and said that he really had no choice, so he would not tell anyone about all this. He also asked her in response to tell him a little more about all this from now on. When Lily heard this, she immediately smiled and asked, "Is he really going to tell people whether he likes Oscar, and also that he is not possessed by demons?" He immediately agreed, and when she heard this, she said that it was very good, and also added that she could tell him as much as he wanted, if, of course, she knew it herself. As soon as Romeo heard all this, he even blushed a little. However, he thanked her, and eventually called her captain, as she asked. Lila was pleased that he finally listened to her, and she, of course, did not want to interfere in this, but she understood that if she could help in some way, then she was going to do it. She created a hero who would defeat the Light Dragon in the future with one of her subordinates, so she thought it wasn't that bad since it could work. It was just unusual, so she felt a little uncomfortable about it. It was about time. Oscar was already lying in his room. One of the saints came to him and asked him to answer honestly. She just wanted to find out something from him. And the woman, coming closer to his bed, asked if it was true that he had been hit by His Highness, the Crown Prince of Rio from Auraria. As soon as Oscar heard this, he was a little surprised. He said that of course it was all true, but he already wanted to explain that it was not as they thought. But the guy didn't have time to explain anything, because everyone who was there was very surprised. They couldn't believe that the heir could really do that to Oscar. People were just horrified. Then Oscar screamed and said that everything was not as they thought, He wanted to explain everything because he understood that Rio could get into a very bad way because of this. At that moment, the guy remembered how he had calmed him down and told him that he was safe, and of course, he was very grateful to him for such help. Oscar's eyes began to fill with tears, his face turned red, and he said that the Crown Prince was just trying to help him. He didn't mean to do anything bad or even illegal. Some time passed. Lily was sitting in the same living room with Romeo, she was drinking tea, and the guy was lying on the sofa and reading a book. Lily seriously considered whether it had been a mistake to make Romeo her subordinate, since she still wasn't entirely sure about this man. They spent only one day together. However, for the girl, it was so much time that she even felt a little uncomfortable about it all. Romeo was lying down and reading a book, turned to her, said that something funny was written there, and also asked if the captain would like to look at it. Lily looked at him in surprise at this point, and wondered if he was being too direct with her. However, she was also pleased by the fact that comics were present in this world, because she loved them. They sat in silence for a while. Then she said she thought someone had come because there was a knock on their door. The guy replied that he heard it too. However, in the end, the two of them remained sitting, each in their own place, without trying to go and open the door for this man. She looked at Romeo, trying to make him understand that he should go and open it. The guy slammed his book shut and, sighing heavily, went to the door. He was very angry because he didn't want to do it, and he also said that he had just gotten to the most interesting part, and so he was incredibly annoyed by the fact that he had to interrupt. Lily, who in the meantime continued to sit in place, thought that he really did look like a subordinate, grumbling just like that when he was told what to do. What surprised her a little was that it all seemed so casual, as if he did this all the time. Soon, Romeo finally opened the door and said that it was probably the priest, as always, because the time for prayer would soon come, so he probably came in to remind them of this. However, as soon as the guy opened the door, he was a little surprised. He immediately frowned and, rudely turning to this man, asked what he needed at all. At that moment, Lilia immediately realized that this was not a priest at all, so she went to the door and then saw the man she definitely did not expect to see in her room. Oscar stood right in front of them, incredibly embarrassed and very upset. He had thought many times that this was a bad idea, but he still never gave up on coming to her. Romeo suddenly raised his voice when the guy didn't answer and said that he actually asked him why he came at all and also called him a baby. When Lilia saw such terrible behavior, she was very surprised. However, the guy continued to shout and asked what was wrong with the royal family. Did they really not teach him to speak, since he just stood there and kept silent? Lily was surprised at this moment because she understood perfectly well that Oscar was also from a royal family, and he learned such things in this place when he was raised by good parents, so she thought that this place was definitely not good for him. However, she did not dwell on all this too much, and looking at Oscar, noticed that he looked rather scared. Although this did not surprise her at all, because this was to be expected from the future emperor, who was supposed to take this place at a young age, and even against his will. Therefore, the girl immediately turned to her assistant, and shouting at him, asked him to stop scaring the one who came to this place without any reason. The guy, of course, didn't like all this, but sighing heavily, he said that he wouldn't do it again and called her captain again. Oh, soon after hearing this, he immediately became interested. He did not understand why this person who does not obey anyone suddenly began to call the crown prince in this way. However, he decided to find out a little later. Lily invited him in and had tea with her. When they sat down at a small table near the window, she immediately asked why he had suddenly come. The guy was so scared and uncomfortable that he even started stuttering. He said that he only came to thank her for what happened the previous day. But Lily immediately cut him off when he continued to apologize and said that there was no need to mention what exactly happened, because he didn't even have to worry about the fact that he had behaved in any way wrong. At that moment, she felt a little sad, and hanging her head down, sighing heavily, she plunged into thought. In fact, Lily was going to pretend she hadn't seen any of this at all and forget the whole situation, because she had thought about going and helping for a long time before doing it. The girl felt guilty about this, because she had stood for a long time and watched Oscar sit in the corner and suffer because of his fear. So now she felt very uncomfortable that he thanked her so much. To break the awkward silence a little, she turned to Oscar and asked if he was hungry and if he wanted a snack. The guy, hearing this, immediately became happy and said that he was very grateful and would be happy to have something to eat. He explained that he should at least give her something to eat to fix all this, although this is exactly what Romeo brought him once. However, after handing the girl the food, he told her to enjoy it as well, because he would be uncomfortable if he only ate. Romeo, meanwhile, hearing that the conversation was about him, immediately decided to join them, and getting up from his seat, approached the table. He decided not to stand on ceremony, so he approached Oscar and asked, "Is it really true that the guy stutters because he had an attack before?" As soon as Lilia heard him address him disrespectfully, she immediately yelled, but the guy wasn't going to listen to her. He wanted to get his way, and Oscar wasn't trying to hide it. He said he only stuttered when he was incredibly anxious, and it happened by accident. He had no control over it. At that moment, Romeo decided to make fun of him a little and also started to stutter, saying that he also does it sometimes every day. Lily couldn't take it anymore. She slammed her hands on the table and started yelling at Romeo, telling him to stop already. She said that he couldn't bully his friends so much, with whom he had so much in common. The guy, hearing this, got angry himself and asked who told her that they were friends. He couldn't stand him.